Sawasdee krap. Hello, good morning from Bangkok. My name is Thitinan Pongsutirak. I'm the director of the Institute of Security International Studies at Chulalongkorn University. We now have a campus closure lockdown, so we're doing this webinar via Facebook Live from home. And we have a good list of lineup of speakers today to analyze and maybe tease out some of the key dynamics and trends for Myanmar. Our topic today is Myanmar and taking stock of Myanmar after 6 months since the coup on February 1st. A lot has happened. There are a number of events, webinars, conferences to take note of this 6-month mark. I think that all of the events are not very optimistic about the situation moving forward. As we know, Myanmar, it's so dramatic what's happening in addition to, after 5 decades of dictatorship, military dictatorship, very topsy-turvy period, and it looked like Myanmar was on a course of political liberalization, economic reform, development progress from 2011 for a decade really until the last 6 months. But the last 6 months have been dark and almost a return to the 5 decades of dictatorship. The latest is not great news out of Myanmar that the Tatmadaw, the coup leader, Senior General Min Aung Hlaing, has appointed himself prime minister and intending to carry on, to consolidate. Moving forward, there'll be a lot of issues about Myanmar's representation at the United Nations, especially next month. The UN, I think, has a dilemma about who to recognize as Myanmar's legitimate representative. And it's a dilemma because Myanmar had an election just last November. This is like 8 months ago. And the election results are very clear in 2020, like they were in 2015. The National League for Democracy won hands down, resoundingly. And so I think the coup in February was a complete reversal. I think it was devoid of legitimacy in the eyes of most of the world. So the last 6 months since the coup, there have been a lot of violence, between the military, the Tatmadaw, and the ethnic armed organizations, but also the Myanmar people from the outset have resisted the military coup. There has been a civil disobedience movement, the CDM, along with the ethnic armed organizations, and now the latest, the PDF, the People's Defense Force, also kind of a grassroots movement to resist and fight back against military rule. And then there's the CRPH, the committee representing Pyidaungsu Hluttaw, a number of parliamentarians that were elected. They organized to try to have a voice and setting up a national unity government, a civilian-led national unity government, and the UN will have to think about which is to recognize the NUG or the military government in Myanmar. And within the UN, there's also a lot of issues, whether China and Russia have been supporting, providing support for the Myanmar military regime, and the US, the UK, and France in the P5 on the other side, and the broader UN members also have had some indications. They had a resolution non-binding recently to impose a kind of arms embargo on the Myanmar military. So a lot has happened on the inside the country, in the region. ASEAN, the Association of Southeast Asian Nations, 10-member organization in Southeast Asia, have been, I think, ineffective, unable to find a way forward to promote dialogue and reconciliation and any kind of a return to democratic process prior to the coup. So ASEAN had a major meeting in April, I think April 24th, and was supposed to come up with, it had a 5-point consensus, was supposed to come up with an ASEAN envoy to spearhead a regional process of dialogue, of conversations between the Tatmadaw, the military, and the opposition groups. But so far, after many weeks now, ASEAN has been unable still to appoint an envoy. And without ASEAN's constructive role, instrumental role, I think the international community will be limited. There's a lot of frustrations with ASEAN. So I'll come to these issues and we will try to kind of have a conversation, interaction. There are a number of events taking place. ISIS Thailand is pleased to and also feels duty bound to also do an event on this. We've been keeping a close tab on regional issues, and Myanmar now is at the forefront. We also want to talk a little bit about COVID-19. The pandemic also has exacerbated and compounded the situation inside Myanmar, from having gone now from bad to worse, with a potentially a runaway pandemic situation, with rising infections and climbing, mounting death toll. So on that note, let me introduce. We have 5 speakers today, and I think a good mix. We have first. You can see their bios in our emails and website and Facebook and so on. But just very briefly, we have Dr. Matt Arnold. Matt Arnold has had a very illustrious career. He actually was based at one point at Chulalongkorn University as a senior fellow with ISIS Thailand, but he also worked in conflict areas in Afghanistan, in Africa. So he's an expert on conflicts, internal conflicts, and beyond. He was the head of the Asia Foundation in Yangon until recently, until March when he had to leave. But he's been keeping a close tab and staying on top of the situation on the ground in Myanmar. He has some data, some observations to share about where the direction of the conflict is going between the resistance and the military government. And then I'll come to Amin Tant, is a journalist with a features editor with Frontier Myanmar, and she has a lot of contacts, sources, and situation on the ground. She also was based in Myanmar, inside Myanmar until recently. And then I'll come to Aung Zaw, the editor of the Irrawaddy magazine. Irrawaddy has been now almost back to what it has been doing so well, which is to cover issues and the dynamics inside the country. So the Irrawaddy now is a major source of information analysis and insights. Aung Zaw also has been doing this for some years. He's seen the conflict back in the 1990s. So over the last 3 decades, he has I think a rare vantage point to look back and forward as well, to see where we are and what we are likely to see moving forward. And then I'll come to Debbie Stothard from Out ASEAN. She is a long time advocate on ASEAN issues for human rights, for civil liberties and democratic reforms, to see what she thinks, how she sees the situation unfolding and moving forward. And then finally, I'll come to Ambassador Kasit Pirom, who is a former foreign minister of Thailand back in 2008 to 2011. He has been working actively to promote dialogue, reconciliation, but also to call out and to galvanize and ASEAN parliamentarians, ASEAN lawmakers, and the entire ASEAN organizations to do more, to do more in order to go back, to return to a democratic process in Myanmar. So first, maybe just 10 minutes of remarks each. Dr. Matt Arnold, may I invite you to share with us? I mean, your take on the situation now after all that has happened over the last 6 months is breathtaking. It's incredible what a reversal of political fortune we've been seeing. But how do you see the situation now unfolding and moving forward?
Yes, thank you very much for hosting me today, and it's my pleasure to be back at ISIS. What I want to talk about today is what I consider to be an escalating revolt against the SAC. There are many things we could talk about today, especially after the announcements of the junta leader yesterday. However, I would like to focus on what I believe is a fundamental point. That is that Myanmar's situation is no longer a political crisis with some conflict. It is now fundamentally an armed conflict spread across the whole country. I will try and explain this in as much detail as possible. Also, let me say up front, this presentation should be really done with a PowerPoint, given that I will talk about a lot of locations. But unfortunately, I cannot produce this presentation. I have a repetitive stress in my hand at the moment, so I can't really type. But just some key points up front. I've been doing a research project the last couple months, so this is a presentation of some of that. And so the two main takeaways that I want to argue is that when we examine the period of April 23 up to July 11th, a period of approximately 2.5 months, this demonstrates that Myanmar's population has increasingly risen in revolt against the Myanmar junta, which seized power by the coup on 1 February. I chose April 23 as a useful marker for examination, as it was the day before the Asean summit when the junta committed to ceasing violence against the citizens of Myanmar. Yet since then, the level of violence has continued, and it's spread across much of the country. It's evolved in form, but it's still very significant. Fundamentally, I think what this is a national uprising and self-defense. Armed resistance to the SAC clearly escalated following several months of the SAC's brutal assaults on peaceful CDM participants and peaceful protesters. As such, armed resistance to SAC is now widely viewed by the Myanmar public as self-defense against a murderous military regime. This self-defense has manifested itself most distinctly in the form of localized militias, many of which are known as People's Defense Forces, and some of which partner with long-established ethnic armed organizations. This revolt against SAC should be understood as a national uprising rather than as a civil war. This distinction is important because it highlights a basic point. The violence in Myanmar is near universally between the public and one institution, the SAC military regime, which enjoys little to no public support. Aside from some fighting between the ethnic armed groups in Shan State, notably the Restoration Council of Shan State and the Shan State Progress Party, the violence across Myanmar overwhelmingly involves the SAC and its immediate affiliates rather than being intra-communal violence or between non-SAC armed groups. Another point is that resistance is nationwide. Violence is widespread, conflict is widespread with all 14 states and regions, plus Naypyidaw experiencing conflict incidents. In the research that I did between 23 April to 11 July, it cataloged 1,315 conflict incidents. These conflict incidents cover a range of confrontations between the Myanmar public and a range of SAC security forces, the foremost being the Tatmadaw itself, but also including the police, proxy militias, the administrative apparatus, and other state organs under SAC control. The most common incidents are armed clashes, assassinations, and sabotage. The enumeration I use does not include regular protests unless significant violence resulted in deaths, nor does it include the arrests of individuals by SAC security forces unless they are mass protests. Note that I focused on what I consider conflict incidents, and I make no claims to be monitoring violence purely in itself. So when we look at these 1,315 conflict incidents from 23 April to 11 July 2021, we see some interesting things. Well, the first is that 231 townships, or 70% of all the townships in the country, have experienced at least one or two conflict incidents between 23 April to 11 July. For comparison, the Asia Foundation concluded that 36% of townships, or 118 of the country's 330 townships, were contested areas, i.e. conflict affected in 2016. The expansion of incidents following the coup has been notable over the latter half of May onwards. And every week now we see additional townships experiencing conflict incidents. Another key point is that we see violence across the states, but also across the regions. Conflict is not limited to nor concentrated in the ethnic minority-dominated states as it has been historically. Out of the 1,315 incidents between April 23 to 11 July, 61% of those occurred in regions and 39% in the states. Yangon experienced the most incidents out of all the states and regions with 272 incidents. Sagaing had the second most with 201. Shan and Kachin are next in terms of volume with 139 and 133 incidents respectively. Mandalay has seen significant numbers of incidents, but there has also been increasing numbers across the regions, Irrawaddy, Bago, and Magway. Chin, Kaya, and Cayenne states have also had significant waves of incidents. The one state that has had little conflict since the coup, Rakhine, has seen an uptick in incidents in Tandwe Township since mid-June. That provides a wider view, but what we can also tell is that certain townships are particularly conflict affected. So while incidents are taking place across the country, certain townships seem to be bearing a heavy burden. So for instance, of the 1,315 incidents, 686 of them, or roughly half of the total, are from just 42 townships. While some of these townships have historically experienced conflict between the Tatmadaw and EAOs on and off for decades, such as Momok Township in Kachin State, Kukai Township in Shan State, and Papun in Cayenne State, other hotspots are in townships that have not seen conflict in decades, and some not since World War II. For instance, the township with the highest number of incidents over previously placid Minjan Township in central Mandalay region. Furthermore, Kalay and Kani townships in Sagaing have been amongst the highest in the country, along with Langtaya and Tinganyun townships in Yangon region. Then we also see significant conflict in secondary cities like Bago, Loika, Hakka, as well as in Damoso and Mindat. All of this needs to be qualified, of course, because it's clear that there's no universal standard for a measuring block for what is an incident in a conflict situation. So we need to nuance it a little bit, and incidents aren't necessarily a clean one-to-one comparator. So what we can do is that enumerating the number of conflict incidents provides an understanding of the presence of armed resistance, but it does not provide a sense of the scale, intensity, or pace of what is still a nascent uprising. Some incidents are inherently more significant in terms of the violence entailed, the scale in terms of participants, or their social and political implication. Some incidents are significant battles in themselves, often involving long-established EAO and Tatmadaw combat units employing landmines, mortars, rockets, artillery, and on the Tatmadaw side, even fighter jets. Other incidents are significant firefights involving automatic guns and even heavy weaponry, such as rocket-propelled grenades. Nonetheless, numerous other types of incidents are significant in their own ways. The targeted assassinations of ward and village tract administrators who work on behalf of SAC, amongst a wide range of other targets in the state apparatus, is of strategic significance as they are crippling SAC's control over the state apparatus at the point where it interacts with the public. Ambushes and assaults on SAC forces utilizing traditional Toomey rifles have also proven significant in their own way, while SAC is suffering significant casualties in places such as Chin and Western Sagaing. To understand Myanmar's burgeoning conflict, it is necessary to assess the full spectrum of incidents now unfolding. And what we see is an emerging range across Myanmar of localized conflict types involving an ever-expanding variety of conflict incidents. Certain areas exhibit characteristics that have defined insurgencies in the country for decades, albeit at a greater scale and intensity. This is notably around fixed ongoing battles to control strategic hilltops, as well as road corridors in the northeast, and especially in Papuan Township in Cayenne State. Kutai and Mok townships in Kachin State, for instance, have seen a range of EAOs, especially the Kachin Independence Army, in the latter clash over weeks, even months, with units of the Tatmadaw. These incidents are significant battles in themselves, involving hundreds, if not thousands, of combatants. The KIA is clearly achieving offensive gains of territory and expanding the scope and intensity of its war against SAC forces in the northeast. For instance, it has taken multiple strategic hilltops across Kachin State. These incidents are also significant in scale between newly formed civilian defense groups that are battling SAC forces. For instance, the Chinland Defense Force and different Karenni PDFs. Conversely, urban townships ranging from Hang Taya, Samchang, Tingayun, and Yangon to secondary cities such as Taunji, Mewati, Dawei, and Michina have seen the emergence of regularized, relatively low-intensity violence that displays unique traits for Myanmar. Most notably, these incidents are in urban areas and is a type of warfare that emphasizes bomb attacks, targeted assassinations, and arson and grenade attacks. While some gun battles have occurred in urban areas, such as central Mandalay, these are still not the norm. Chin and Cayenne states are the most conflict areas. When we look at the number and type of incidents relative to their comparably small population, we can say that Kaya and Chin have witnessed significant conflict since the coup. In Chin, 4 of its 9 townships have experienced relatively significant amounts of incidents, while Mindot and Hakka townships are 2 of the most conflict-affected townships in the whole country. Since early May, the Chinland Defense Force, which only formed in March, quickly emerged as a sizable and competent force capable of engaging the Tatmadaw and running battles, so much so that the Tatmadaw has repeatedly agreed to ceasefires with the group. Kaya, Damoso, and Loikaw townships have experienced, Damoso and Loikaw townships in Kaya have experienced significant incidents against the Tatmadaw by newly formed Karenni PDFs, at times collaborating with pre-existing Karenni EAOs. Together with Pekan Township in southern Shan State, this triangle of townships is one of the most concentrated areas of conflict in the country. Okay, we can conclude by saying one takeaway is that Sagaing is emerging as the epicenter of conflict in the country. 35 out of the 37 townships in the region have emerged with conflict. We also see significant other townships across the country that have emerged, Chaito, Tatan, and Ye in the south, but also in Ayeyarwady, places like Pyapyong, down in the Delta. We're also seeing significant conflict along the 2 major land border crossings in Muse and Mewati. Let me just conclude by saying COVID-19 is the big wild card. I don't have any very clear predictions on what will happen. All I can say is that areas that have had COVID for a while now, for instance, in Chin or Gangnao and northern Magway, we've still seen pretty significant conflict even as the pandemic has escalated. So I'll leave it at that. And again, let me say thank you to ISIS and especially Professor Pyidaungsu for hosting me today.
Thank you very much, Dr. Matt Arnold. I'm just going to ask you a very quick follow-up based on your presentation. And later on, we would like to try to show, include your PowerPoint slides eventually, or your work on our social network platforms. You mentioned the distinction between just a civil war and national uprising. This is from the thrust of your remarks, is a national uprising. It's almost like the whole country against the military. You've done field work in Sudan, in Afghanistan, and you've seen a lot of these internal conflicts. Is something you've been working on a lot in your career. What's the chance of the opposition groups in Myanmar against an organized, well-armed, budgeted Tatmadaw Myanmar military? What's the chance of the opposition groups based on what you've seen?
Well, I would frame it. I mean, the point about it being a national uprising is fundamental, because this is an institution, no matter how well funded or well armed it supposedly is, within a country of 52 million people, and it's very difficult to find any historical comparator to that. I mean, I worked in Syria as well. Syria was a civil war. No matter how much a lot of the country hated Assad. Sudan, the same with Bashir before he was ousted. Afghanistan, the Taliban has always had significant support in certain areas. Myanmar, the senior generals have quite spectacularly managed to turn the entire country against them. And they continue to use barbaric forms of violence that is only going to deepen that. Specific to your point, Jay, I would say that I think we overestimate the strength of the Tatmadaw. People use this number of 350,000. This is actually misleading. This is not 350,000 combat troops. I think credible estimates show that the Tatmadaw probably has less than 100,000 actual combat troops. Most of the Tatmadaw, like any conventional military, is in support roles. And what we know is that some of the most potent parts of the Tatmadaw, the light infantry divisions, are being stretched thin because they're being tasked to run around the country and tamp down uprisings where they see them. I doubt this is sustainable. The other issue for the Tatmadaw, just to be quick, is twofold. One is that the Tatmadaw has many bases. It's actually ridiculous how many bases the Tatmadaw has around the country. And in the context of a national uprising, this is very problematic, because when the whole population hates you, it becomes very difficult to sustain so many bases. Second point is that the Tatmadaw is going to struggle it's going to struggle to recruit, because it's so viscerally loathed now. I think this is also compounded by the fact that men on Hlang in the military have absolutely no ideological basis behind them. There's nothing to them in terms of something that would galvanize wider public support. And Min Aung Hlaing, he talked yesterday, for instance, about protecting Buddhism, but I think he through the barbarity, especially over March and April, the Tatmadaw so destroyed any shred of credibility that it might have been able to build off, that, to answer your question, yes, fundamentally, the SAC is not in a good position. And if the Myanmar people revolt against it, they can succeed.
Okay, thank you very much. That's very clear. So I think the battlefield dynamics are fluid. We tend to think from outside that the Tatmadaw, the military, has control, it's consolidating, but in fact, maybe it's overstretched, and maybe the next 6 months we could be seeing a turnaround on battlefield dynamics. Let me move on to Amin Tant. Amin Tant is a journalist with Frontier Myanmar, and from your vantage point, your sources, your contacts, situation inside the country with the CDM, also they've been slapping charges and conducting the Tatmadaw through the state authorities, conducted these trials of Aung San Suu Kyi and others and so on, including her advisor, Sean Tennell. So the situation is more repression. What are some of your impressions and the latest that you've heard, and what's your view, Amin Tan, at this time?
Yeah, so thank you for having me. I think what we're seeing now in Myanmar is a lot of different groups trying to consolidate power and the ability to really function as the government of Myanmar. So when people talk about the coup, I like to always make sure to say that this is an incomplete coup. The military has been able to usurp the elected NLD-led government, but they have not been able to actually behave as government beyond sort of, I suppose, killing people and jailing people. So you see the SAC on one hand trying to create a dynamic in which they have to be regarded as the state. So, COVID-19 is a really good example of this, where instead of allowing private citizens to see doctors of their own choosing, regardless of whether or not they are in a public hospital, to buy oxygen to treat their illnesses, especially COVID. They are trying to route resources and people into government-controlled or military-controlled public hospitals in order to ensure that, in order for people to get care, to get the sort of services that a government normally provides, and to stay alive, really, in this case in Myanmar, people are forced to at least tacitly acknowledge that the SAC is the government. See this kind of spreading out into the administrative arms as well. So if a private citizen, for example, wants to buy supplemental oxygen now, they are now forced to try and seek approval from an SAC administrator in order to do that. And so they've turned the acknowledgement of the SAC of government into a life and death situation in a lot of these cases. And then you see other groups such as the National Unity Government now trying to consolidate power as well. They have, even though these are not necessarily people who were elected, many of them are, but not everyone, since many people were arrested on February 1st. These are people who still have a popular mandate from the people, who, for the most part, have the sort of moral authority, and you see them trying to partner with ethnic health education providers, especially, and trying to provide to members of the civil servant population who are participating in the disobedience movement, trying to that function of government, and have the advantage of having these sort of public, and now they're also trying to build up that actual logistical capacity as government. And then you also have these various ethnic armed groups and the sort of ethnic politics who are also trying to make sure that in their hopefully democratic Myanmar, that they do not get relegated back into the situation they were in the last 10 years, in which, the last 5 years, in which, even though there was a democratically elected government in Myanmar, these groups, which represent very large portions of the nation, were sidelined. Their sort of desires and advocacy were sort of put to the side, and in many cases, the segment really imposed their will upon the border areas in a way that was really unwanted by the people living in those regions. And you also see civilian populations essentially trying to build non-government parallel structures of mutual aid, of providing oxygen, providing funeral services, providing food for one another, because many people have lost their jobs or are and are unable to provide for themselves, and providing education. You have a lot of online education resources now for Burmese, in Burmese languages, and people really trying to recreate the resources that, in theory, a government would normally provide, without necessarily having to either advocate for the National Unity Government or interact with the SAC in any way. And the situation is becoming more and more complex on the ground in terms of kind of figuring out who leaders are and who to sort of interface with. I think one really important thing to take away from this, and Professor Arnold talked about this as well, is that the military is seen as essentially a foreign occupying force. They have very little numbers actually in the military, as well as the people who support them. And this isn't a situation that is very comparable even to neighboring regions, and for example, countries like Thailand, where there are significant portions of the pot on either side who various political leaders to be in charge of the country. This is truly a mass majority against a very, very small minority. And even as the situation gets more complicated, I think it's important for us to remember that it is at its core a very simple crisis in which the people voted. The results were overwhelmingly for one party. They were overwhelmingly clear. One side is committing all manners of atrocities and likely to, under really any circumstances, become a government that does really put the lives of the entire population at risk for financial gain, political gain, whatever. And the other side is a largely peaceful group who are trying to ensure that they can return to a country that, or at least try to build a country that is built on rule of law and justice and having a level of democratic governance.
Okay, thank you very much, Amy Tan. Can you give us a sense of the humanitarian crisis, the humanitarian conditions inside the country in Yangon and beyond? Before COVID, we've had almost 2 years of COVID now, but the coup already resulted in a humanitarian crisis as people had to flee. A number of people had to come across to Thailand and other countries and so on with the crackdown, with the repression. And now COVID has exacerbated all of this. What's your sense of the unfolding kind of ongoing humanitarian crisis, and what countries like Thailand next door should be expecting or maybe anticipating from inside Myanmar on the humanitarian front?
Has a pretty low spread. The numbers are, sort of contested and unclear, but Thailand does seem to host a very large proportion of the Myanmar population. By some estimates, up to almost 10% of people that exist are in Thailand. And the coup, when conflict, or at really any time conflict breaks out in Myanmar, they tend to break out along the border regions, and it tends to send tens, if not hundreds of thousands of people fleeing into the jungles, oftentimes into Thailand, India, and Bangladesh. And I think should this continue, we can expect to see a lot more people. This is going to turn into a region-wide refugee crisis, right? Like we've seen in the case of the Rohingya crisis, where once the military decides you are the enemy, all bets are off. You can be subject to any and everything that they can think of. Recently, there was a massacre in which children who were as young as 13, 14, their bodies were found. And we saw people whose bodies were mutilated. Some of them had their eyes gouged out. And so in the face of that, people will leave. And this is exacerbated by the COVID situation, where we're seeing hundreds, if not thousands of people dying every day. And, the reason that range is so wide is because there's simply no real reporting mechanism. People are not getting the help they need. And these estimates are really just coming from who are at this point having to ask people to wait in line to bury their loved one. And on top of that, the COVID crisis plus the sort of armed conflict, there's also the issue of a situation in which hundreds of thousands of people are to continue to work as civil servants, which means they largely have no income. And then because of COVID, and then because of the coup, and then just sort of the underdevelopment of Myanmar in general, people don't have income, which means they won't be able to eat. And at a certain point, leaving will be the only option to stay alive. And we could potentially, I think, see millions of people trying to flee.
Okay, that's very dire. Thank you. Also, we had the estimate recently, I think, from the UK authorities in Myanmar that maybe up to half of the country, or half of the population, could be infected with the COVID-19. So that's something else that it hasn't been confirmed, but the numbers are going to be high. Thank you very much, Amin Tan. Let me move. I will come back to you and also Dr. Matt Arnold. I think so far what you both have said in your remarks is that don't take it for granted that the SAC's the Administration Council, the Tatmadaw, will remain in control and able to consolidate, because the odds are maybe stacked against them as a whole country, the whole population turns against them. Let me turn now to Aung Zaw. Aung Zaw, I mean, this is not 1990s, right? Or is it? You have the correlation of forces, the balance seems very lopsided here. You have mainly of course, the Tatmadaw, the Myanmar military, the State Administration Council, and lots of troops and weapons and so on. But it's almost the whole country population, through various opposition groups, they're lined up against the Tatmadaw in all sorts of ways. So from your vantage point, seeing the 1990s, 1980s, and the progress in the 2010s, and now 2021, 6 months of this, are we going to see kind of a long-term stalemate, and with the military kind of in power, but not really in control? It cannot govern, but can have power? Or maybe there'll be a turnaround. The military is on the losing end. The forces against the military is so powerful, widespread, vast majority that this is untenable for the SAC. What do you think?
Right. Well, a lot of questions, Titina. Good morning, everyone. Thank you for having me again. Well, I think I would like to start saying that I feel like sharing experience as a boat full of passengers was drowning or sinking, and we are watching, and we can do very little. This is how I want to open this morning sessions, because we have seen it 1988. I myself was in Yangon, and one of the protester demonstrators, student activists, was in an underground movement since 1987, and for 2 years until 1988. Now we've seen again that thousands of people, young, educated, rich and poor, migrant workers, activists, students are fleeing and flood the country. And if the situation continues like this, I think I would say that millions of people will leave the country. And Thailand, China, and the neighboring countries all should be prepared for the worst case scenarios in the next coming 6 months. So let me take you back to the 62-88 briefly. We have seen the military coup in 1962 and 1988 again. And the previous coup, compared to the current one, the military leaders in the past, they seem to have a more caliber, ability. They cunning and brutal. They all like barbarians. They behave like a barbarian. They are. But at least they have a clear vision in the past. They were able to control the administration, bureaucracy, and they're able to restore the law and order to gain some level of confidence from the public. And civil servants were returned to work. That was in 1988. After a year or 2 years of military coup in 1988, the regime was firmly in control. But today, we've seen that the Myanmar, or the country, Burma, stand at the brink of state failure. The people of Myanmar are clearly, they don't want the return of the military rule. The large population of the government of civil servants, they refused to go back to work, and they opposed the regime and military coup. And the private banks still struggled to reopen. The regime didn't gain effective control of the administration and the bureaucracy. And I still continue to deploy the very violence against the people. So far, over 900 people being killed, over 4,000 people put in prisons. Like in the past, we have been facing the militaries acting like foreign occupying forces. At the same time, the investment and foreign companies from the region, from Japan, Malaysia, including Telenor and Petronas, they have left the country. The West continue to disengage and impose the symbolic sanctions. The US and other countries and neighboring countries, including Singapore and Malaysia and Indonesia, they're calling for the restore of democracy. There are new civilian fighters, as a Professor Matthew Arnold, I think, presented, that we have faced a new uprising in urban areas in the countryside. And even in an urban city like in Yangon, where I used to live, we have seen a daily bomb attack, a target assassination, and armed revolution. And they are spreading everywhere. In 1988, when I was in the jungle in the Thai Myanmar border areas, I saw many students and many friends and activists who were hoping to go home and fight back the regime. But they are stuck in Thailand, or either they will struggle to remain in Thailand like us, or they resettle to third countries. But this time is very different. I see very new dynamic emerging. That a lot of youth who have taken arms training in the so-called liberation areas or ethnic armed areas, they've been able to penetrate back into the countries, or the heartland of the countries, or central Burma. And dozens of civilian fighting forces have been established across the country. I think the military seems to be taken aback because not just the scale of the protest, but they are also very surprised to see how organized, not by the NLD and Aung San Suu Kyi, but the network of people and the youth and the younger generation and Generation Z. They're very well equipped, and not like in our time, and they're tech savvy, they're well connected, they have traveled abroad, they have taste of the freedom and democracy, and they don't want to see the return of the military and military coup. So today, looking at the Myanmar, I think the trajectory is very alarming. The country seems to be heading to the wrong direction. It become ungovernable. The health care system is collapsed. Myanmar is, if you talk about the COVID-19, Myanmar is becoming a super spreader in the region. The illicit trade and the drug production along the Thai-Myanmar border has been increased. And that should be a great concern for the region, I think. The coup also drives millions of people into the poverty. There's also a crack in the military. I'm talking about the soldiers and the officer who have quietly or openly joined the CDM movement. So military has difficult and struggle to control this inner rank and file of the soldiers and officers. So the coup itself is a catastrophe, but the bad news is that the regime is determined to remain in power. Whatever the reason, whatever the justification they have on the military coup, they have completely misjudged and miscalculated the people. But they have grabbed the tiger's tail, and they cannot release it now. So in 6 months' time, yesterday we see that they have established the caretaker government, and they talk about extension of the election emergency period up to 2023, and there will be an election. But I don't really think that they can, or they will be able to hold the election in the next 2 years. Because if you look at the psychology of the military, Myanmar military leaders, they will only if they feel secure, if they feel confident, they will hold the election. It will be military guided election or transition, like in 2010. It may happen or it may not happen in the future. So they have also made up their minds that if there's election, if there's a political transition guided by the military in the future, there will be no Aung San Suu Kyi nor the NLD. So they want that this time Aung San Suu Kyi and NLD to be out of the pictures. And they have burned the bridges. There's no way to return like in a status quo like in before 2020. So it has reached to the point of no return. They have burned the bridges, and the difficult road is ahead. And still, after 6 months, I would say that the attempted coup is not successful. Not yet. This is extraordinary, I think. In a 6-month time in 1988, we've seen that military was firmly in control. They're very brutal, they're like a barbarian, but still, I think they have able to run the government, behave like a government. The investment coming in, the majority of population call into submissions. But this time, you can see the revolution happening everywhere. You can see the armed resistance movement taken up in the countryside and urban areas. And because of that, I think it demands the ASEAN, UN. I hate to talk about ASEAN. I don't want to fool myself talking about ASEANs. I don't expect a lot from ASEAN. But a lot of people, including the US, China, and Japan, or UN even, they identifying ASEAN as an organization to engage with the regime and other stakeholders. So I think it's important that in the next discussion, I think upcoming discussion, ASEAN, how ASEAN, China, and UN and the West, how they're going to engage Myanmar and how they're going to put the country back on the right track. I think we have to wait and see. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Aung Zaw. And from your vantage point, I think this is very significant that you said that this is different than 88, than in the past. The balance of forces, the directions, the correlation of forces. Back then, the military was overwhelming and was able to consolidate and control. And because it had control, it imposed law and order, and people went along with it. This time, people are not going along with it. You mentioned the young people. This is a trend not just in Myanmar. The millennials, the Gen Z, people under 30s, in their 20s. So would you think that the last 10 years of opening and opportunities made the big difference here, that Myanmar cannot be put back in the military dictatorship bottle? The genie has been out over the last 10 years, and that's for the long term. What do you think?
Yeah, I totally agree. I think either we call it a gold-plated democracy or gold-plated political transition. I think they have made a big mistake by opening up the country, and genie is out of the bottle. So I think last 10 years, even if it is artificial democracy, whatever transition that we have seen, and I was able to myself was back to the country for so many times, almost every 2 or 3 months, I'm back in the country. We have seen build up a large network inside the country. I feel like I don't have to go back to my country for the next 10 years. I don't have to, because we have a large network inside the country, and the people, and we have seen a lot of young people and who are tech savvy and very open, and they travel abroad and they have tasted freedom. And I think that is I think one of the very encouraging signs. I would say that I remain quite cautiously optimistic that those people, even my staff, who have left the country over the recent months because of the military coup and because of the safety, you can see them that they have every morning, every afternoon, every evening, they have a contact, can talk to family members, and they have a network inside, huge network inside. They have because in 88 we were in the jungle. We were, even to get the snail mail from my parents, it took a year or 2 years to wait to get the snail mail from the letters, the correspondence from the family members, or they could be arrested. But this time, in the morning when they turn on the phones, they can connect with their family members and they can talk about the situation inside. And it's a very different situation. I think that's why this dynamic is very interesting for us and also give us hope. It's a sense of hope that I think military, if you're in Min Aung Hlaing's shoes, I don't think he will be able to control this population, this new dynamic, new generation, who will not give up.
Thank you very much. And also, I think you just alluded to the role, the empowering role of the information technologies, the social media, and the ways to communicate. This has been, I think, the fundamental, maybe the most dramatic difference, I think, from the 1980s, 1990s. Let me move on to let's talk a little bit about ASEAN. Aung Zaw has mentioned, and by the way, so far what I've heard from Dr. Arnold, Min Tan, and Aung Zaw, it suggests that this is an incomplete coup, for sure. That they can take power, but cannot really govern. The country is ungovernable. But beyond incomplete coup, it sounds from the three presentations so far that this is untenable. That in the medium longer term, Tatmadaw is going to lose. I mean, so let's continue on this trend, this line of discussion. Let me move on to Debbie Stothard, who's been working on rights and freedoms in ASEAN for many years, for decades. And Aung Zaw has just mentioned, Debbie, and we know as well that the regional repercussions are grave. Refugee crisis, even drugs production, and the COVID. We're talking about millions of people maybe having to leave the country. And inside the country, a lot more death toll and a lot of sufferings. ASEAN has been, if you have to say one way or the other, problem or solution so far, has been not part of the solution so far. It had the potential to come up with a modality. And a lot of people talk about ASEAN. I think the international community is in a bind. The US, the UN, the EU, even China. Not Russia as much. I think Russia has all to gain here and is a kind of a new major power in the mix, very opportunistic. But the dilemma for the international community on ASEAN is this. They have to rely on ASEAN as a kind of a go-between or intermediary because they rely on ASEAN for the other regional platforms. The East Asia Summit, the ADMM Plus, and all these other ASEAN cooperative vehicles. So if they bypass or undermine ASEAN on Myanmar, this could spell the end of the ASEAN relevance. And that means for the international community broader, it would undermine the entire regional architecture. This is why I think it's a big dilemma for the international community. From your vantage point, from your view, Debbie, what do you think? We've seen some of this before in the past: repression, military dictatorship, and ASEAN has been split. By the way, the split was from the outset. The reactions to the Myanmar coup from Indonesia, Malaysia, Singapore, and up to a point Philippines, very different than reactions from Cambodia, Laos, and Vietnam, even Thailand and Brunei. So this split now has continued. And I think this split will also carry on into next month when the UN decides on who represents Myanmar. What would be your perspective on the situation so far over the last 6 months and going forward, Debbie?
Firstly, I would say that if I could play poker with ASEAN, I'll be a multimillionaire by now because ASEAN actually can't read through the bluff. ASEAN thought it was being practical by believing Min Aung Hlaing's spin, that the coup was inevitable, that the junta will be in power and stabilize the country within the 3-month deadline. That obviously didn't happen. And what we are seeing now is basically ASEAN was already in a mess. And if you want to see how messed up ASEAN was the failure of a coordinated, comprehensive regional response to the COVID pandemic in the first place. So we could see that there were divisions, siege mentality happening last year. Nobody looked at what was happening in Burma, Myanmar, and the fact that there were two national COVID committees, a military committee where there was no health expert, and the civilian government committee on COVID. And that already should have worried everybody. Now, what we're seeing is if ASEAN moves back to its default of defending a member unconditionally in international fora, it is not just shooting itself in the foot, it's actually stabbing itself in the heart. Because what Min Aung Hlaing has done has actually gone fundamentally against the spirit and content of the ASEAN Charter and of ASEAN's commitments to democracy and political security. So that's one element. The other element is that Matthew Arnold was absolutely correct in warning us that the Tatmadaw was not that monolithic behemoth that was be able to stamp out dissent in the whole country. What we've seen is the Tatmadaw is over reliant on airstrikes. And we already saw complaints from the Air Force that pilots' families were essentially being held hostage to force them to keep doing the airstrikes under command. We saw that the Tatmadaw itself is unable to maintain or carry out more than two offensives at the same time. So they can't actually they can't actually handle all the resistance that's on the ground. And what we've also seen is that the disproportionate response to resistance has created this economic crisis where 80%, nearly 80% of all bank branches remain shut throughout the country, where the World Bank last week revised its estimates and predicted that the Burmese or Myanmar economy will contract, will shrink by 18% for this year alone. And so we already start to understand, firstly, the Tatmadaw, the SAC, is not in de facto control of the country. It has not gained control over the economy, over the political situation, over territory. What they've done is that they've been willing to destroy the domestic economy and attack civilians because they are assuming that that ASEAN will go along with the lie, the bluff that the junta is in de facto control of the country. Well, the SAC doesn't have. If you're doing the arguments in terms of do we recognize the SAC at the UN, firstly, it doesn't have de jure status. It cannot be recognized as a legitimate regime, even under its own flawed constitution. And it doesn't have de facto control of the country. So we need to look at this coup. I mean, ASEAN actually should have understood from the beginning that this coup was a national tantrum of Min Aung Hlaing, who was absolutely angry that he would not be allowed to be president of the country. So once you take that approach, then you start to understand what's happening on the ground and why the military is stuck in this role, because their leader will not let go. And Aung Zaw was correct when he said, basically, they grab the tiger by the tail and they can't do anything about it. ASEAN needs to actually step back and understand the 5-point consensus now is not the only 5 points happening on Burma, Myanmar. We have the military regime's 5 points, we have China's 5 points, and we have ASEAN's 5 points. ASEAN cannot run this situation alone, and they should not be running interference. They should be taking the lead from what China is doing. You know, with the COVID response, China Red Cross started vaccinating people in Kachin State and Shan State closer to their border in order to build a buffer zone, a COVID-free buffer zone for their own Chinese border. And they didn't do it without, they didn't need to seek permission from the junta. And actually, the Kachins and the Shans were quite happy to have China Red Cross in their area, not just because of protection from COVID or the vaccination process, but also they knew that the Tatmadaw would be too afraid to launch airstrikes into that area. So if we want to take that as an example of best practice, then we understand that it's in ASEAN's interest to ensure that there is some kind of cross-border aid, some cross-border health measures being taken along the Thai border, for example, if we want to actually prevent the worst scene scenario. We also need to ensure that ASEAN lends its voice to ensuring that prisoners in places of detention are prioritized for vaccines and access to medical supplies. So when we look at what's happening now, we can understand the military's attempts to to control oxygen supply, to control PPE supply, to control vaccination supply, is because the military itself is panicking because COVID is affecting their personnel. Number one. Number two, we still haven't addressed the fact that the COVID crisis has been worsened by attacks on medical neutrality. The Tatmadaw viewed health workers as the enemy and attacked them accordingly. And so we need to also get ASEAN to stand up against this. So these are some of the issues that we need to address. And I think the reality is what is happening now, it's still not too late for ASEAN to fix its position. It's still not too late for individual states, members of ASEAN, to partner with like-minded states around the country, around the world, around and other ASEAN dialogue partners to fix this problem. I think this is something that we have to understand. And we also need to speak up when we look at this COVID response. The former leader of the head of the COVID response, Dr. Tatalin, was arrested after months-long, many months of manhunt. And she's been charged with treason, which is a capital offense, when instead of doing that, the authorities should have been actually consulting her and working out what best they can do. So if you're looking at what's going to be coming up at the UN in New York next month, the credentials challenge, I think ASEAN has to agree that it's up to individual states on how they want to vote on this issue. It has to realize that if they don't support the NUG or at least abstain from this vote, if they don't support the NUG, they should at least abstain from the vote. Because if they support the SAC junta, we're basically dooming ASEAN to at least another 15 years of military dictatorship and misrule in Myanmar. And, because the military, Min Aung Hlaing, has been focused on his perceived enemy, which is Aung San Suu Kyi. But he basically messed with the wrong generation. If this military regime is not dismantled within the next 2 years, the whole region is going to be dealing with 15 years of resistance. Remember, this movement is led by people in their 20s and 30s, and they're not going to give up easily. So the life of this movement is actually going to go for that long. The life of that resistance is going to be unrelenting. So I think this is also something we have to figure in terms of our scheduling. Do we want to put up with the painful embarrassment or uncomfortable situation of turning our back on the junta, which claims to have de facto control of the country but doesn't? Or do we want to, put that up with that uncomfortable situation for a few months, or do we want to put up with the more horrific threats to human security for the next 15 years? That's where ASEAN needs to locate itself. That's where they have to rethink the situation. And let's not forget, this 5-point consensus in ASEAN is not the only one. We have the military regime's own 5 points, and now we also have China's 5-point plan. So we can't, this is not a sustainable way to go. ASEAN hasn't really been able to progress on how far it's been able to uphold this 5-point. And so I think it's time to actually take this to the UN and be a responsible actor. It is in ASEAN's interest that this coup is not complete. It's in ASEAN's interest that this coup is reversed. And no matter how painful the situation is, it is fixing the situation is much less painful than a 15-year legacy, 15 to 20-year legacy that ASEAN will have to deal with if the military regime is not removed.
Okay, thank you very much, Debbie. I think there has been an underestimation, a misreading by both sides. And one side is the Tatmadaw Min Aung Hlaing. I think he evidently has miscalculated the level and intensity, the sustained resistance from the population. I think he probably was surprised himself. And then I think ASEAN also misread this coup. Thinking that, okay, there's another coup. Thailand had a coup in 2014, Thailand had a coup in 2006, Myanmar had a coup in 1988, so just another coup. But I think this misreading has led to miscalculation about its response. To come, and this 5-point response has been impotent, really. I mean, ineffectual. So moving forward, Debbie, you mentioned about the vaccinations. I want to bring that in a little bit. China, has had this very clever, shrewd mass diplomacy, vaccine diplomacy, and it's been vaccinating its people, but also setting out exporting vaccines. For the Myanmar, inside Myanmar, I think we need to take a regional vaccine approach ultimately. I mean, not in the immediate term, because every country is in trouble. Thailand is just trying to look after itself, it's in big trouble. But longer term, I think next year, we'll have to find ways to have vaccines for the entire region, Southeast Asia, but in particular, the connected mainland Southeast Asia. But for you, along the border, I mean, in terms of Thai-Myanmar border and the humanitarian crisis, what do you think are needed now urgently that Thailand can do or third countries can do to alleviate, to cushion this impact from both the coup and especially the COVID along the borders, because a lot of agencies left, over the last decade?
Good question, Ajahn. The thing is, ethnic health organizations, including those operating along the Thai-Burmese border, have been doing a heroic job of trying to they've already, months ago, they set up their own quarantine protocols for people who are heading to the border area. They've been doing a huge amount of work despite the lack of resources. And I think it's simply a matter of Thailand deciding, yes, we will allow cross-border aid, because the infrastructure and the practices were there until about 8 years ago. So it's not a matter of reinventing the wheel, but actually reactivating the system. And it's very, very clear to those of us who've been working behind the scenes that there are many international actors who will bring in resources that will benefit not just asylum seekers and people displaced on the border, but also frontline staff and Thai population along the border with vaccination and other health supplies. So I think it's actually simply a matter of Thailand, the Thai government basically saying, yes, we will allow this aid to start, and let's open talks, because the resources are there. It's simply a question of access. If Thailand seeks to control the situation and say, no, just give us the resources and we'll handle it ourselves, that's not going to work, because the situation is so the situation is so massive already. The threat is so massive. We do need to have international actors on the ground working in Thailand and with Thailand to deal with the humanitarian crisis, which has been intensified by the COVID pandemic.
Okay, thank you. Thank you. We have a number of questions now coming in, but I want to proceed to our last speaker for now. Ambassador Kasit Pirom. Ambassador Kasit used to be Thailand's foreign minister in 2008 to 2011. He's been very vocal now about what ASEAN should be doing on the Myanmar crisis. Ambassador Kasit, I mean, ASEAN's in trouble, isn't it? Part of the ASEAN dilemma is that the different governments, different regimes in ASEAN, they have their own issues with the nature of the regime in Myanmar. So, more democratic regimes, governments in ASEAN, they tend to be more critical, but those that are more authoritarian tend to be more supportive or sympathetic. What have you been doing in terms of promoting this ASEAN parliamentarians and lawmakers to try to promote a way out of this Myanmar crisis? Tantu Kasit, Ambassador Kasit, please.
Hello to everyone. Thank you, Dr. Titinan and ISIS for allowing me to be part of the panel. And second, to thank profoundly all the previous speakers. I do learn a lot of information, and it gives me a lot of ideas of how that we all could move further to help solve the Myanmar crisis. Let me start from the premise that there will be the prolonged political struggle, that the coup cannot be completed. It's an unfinished symphony because the opposition has become more coordinated and stronger, and at the same time gaining more and more international recognition, although still at the informal basis. But I think there have been a lot of contacts by diplomats and members of parliaments and so on from various democracies towards the NUG and CRPH. At the same time, I think the international community is fully aware of the self-defense forces and the determination of ordinary Myanmar people, or the ethnic groups, especially the youth, that they are determined to regain freedom and to bring back a democracy. So I think the picture at the moment is that there will be the prolonged struggle. Then the question to myself and to all of us is that then how do we help to shorten the struggle? And my answer is that there is a need for regional as well as international intervention immediately. And at the regional level, I do give up hopes for any functions to be carried out further by the ASEAN community, because most of the member states of the ASEAN community are more autocratic or authoritarian. So in that sense, they have not been able to, and they will not be able to do anything about reprimanding or accusing, oppressing, or pressuring, or even to sanctioning the military junta SAC. So I have to forget about ASEAN at this point in time, unless and until all the member states become democratic, or unless and until we have a complete transformation of the ASEAN community into a ASEAN democratic community, which I think a group of fellow politicians in the region led by Mr. Somrangsi of Cambodia has as of May 17, we did launch a new concept on ASEAN, on a new ASEAN by the name of the Southeast Asia community. It will be democratically and human rights based, but keep that aside. Now, since ASEAN cannot do anything, and I don't believe that you will have the will or the determination to do anything, and especially under the leadership of Brunei at the moment, I feel so helpless and hopeless. And I think in a few months it will be Cambodia. My feelings still remain negative. So I have to forget about ASEAN, and I have to ask all of you to turn our attentions towards the international community. I think the responsibility on the Myanmar solution and so on will have to be the international community through the UN Security Council and the UN Secretary General. And within this context, of course, the major democracy, especially the US, the UK, France, and the other members of the European Union, as well as Australia, New Zealand, India, South Korea, Japan, and so on, have to work together to push the UN to be on the forefront for a sort of a simultaneous and parallel undertaking. The first one is to force the ceasefire and cessation of hostility, okay, on both sides. Second is to create a forum for dialogue between the junta and the democratic opposition. Third would be the, I think, provision or to the organization of international medical consortium as well as international humanitarian consortium. And whether the dialogue, the ceasefire, or the humanitarian and the COVID fight and so on cannot be done unless and until there is some sort of peace inside the whole of Myanmar. So in that sense, I would also like to suggest to have a UN international peacekeeping forces or observer for peace and ceasefire and so on, together with some sort of an interim UN administered administration, which we did have the example of Namibia, of Cambodia, of East Timor, and so on, and many other countries, and so on. So it would not be difficult to have the early UN intervention under the leadership of UN Secretary General with the supervision of the UNSC, regardless of whether the Russian say yes or no or not. But I think the rest of the other UNSC members could do a lot of things even outside or by the side of UNSC. It needs the political will and the leadership of the United States, the UK and France, and also to a large extent China in particular. Just for a record, the Chinese government have 20,000 peacekeeping forces operating worldwide under the UN flag. And at the moment, they are organizing a 8,000-man rapid reaction peacekeeping forces. So if there is an agreement for peacekeeping in Myanmar, when ceasefire and the dialogue holding are being announced, I think China would be in the position to send some peacekeeping forces, and that could be combined with Thai, Malaysian, Indonesian, Vietnamese soldiers, and so on. I think that could be done. I don't see any other way out except the international intervention through the UN Secretary General and the UN Security Council. I think those could be done immediately, and under the leadership of the UK, which is now the current chair of UNSC, just organized the UNSC meeting a few days ago. It could organize again for this international peacekeeping interim governance, and then all the humanitarian assistance and the ceasefire and the dialogue and so on. It will have to be a package, and it could be done quickly, and it could be tabled also at the UNGA for international approval and support and so on. And let's see whether Putin and the Russian government can stand aside and be the best knower of the international humanitarian undertaking. If that is to be the case, and so it be, and we all have to sanction the Russians for the inhumane behavior. Then the other point that we could also suggest to the United Nations as a whole is to have a dossier on the genocide and on the crimes against humanity committed by military personnel of the Tatmadaw. I think that has to be done in parallel. Okay, and if they give up now, we can put the dossier aside and let the reconciliation process be done by the Myanmar people themselves. How much and how far are they to forgive the military junta for the atrocity that they have been committing on and off for more than 50 years since the independence of Myanmar, from the British Empire. So these are some of the a few points that I would like to put the emphasis that we now move on to the UN, to the UNSC, and so on. And at one last point is that for the international community to send a very strong word and pressure to the Thai government under the leadership of General Prayut Chan-o-cha to open the border, to allow humanitarian assistance, to allow medical equipment to go in coordination with the UN agency, especially humanitarian department, as well as UNHCR and ICRC. On the ground, I think all the NGOs are ready to cooperate. All the local communities are ready to cooperate, including the hospital of Dr. Cynthia Mong, a current, and then whose hospital has been providing excellent services to the localities and to the displaced Myanmar people. So the Thai government must be forced to end their cordial relationship with the military counterpart in Myanmar. And they have to turn around, and then they have to respect and support the democratic forces of Myanmar and to act as a so-called democratic country. I think otherwise the Thai leadership as well as the other 9 ASEAN leaderships will be also charged for being accomplice to the atrocity committed by the military junta all along. I think so. This is what I would like to say. Thank you very much. ขอบคุณครับ
Okay, thank you very much ครับท่านทูตบาสเกษตร that's something that I want to explore just a little bit, Ambassador Kasit. First, you said about ASEAN is no hope. You know, to quote your remarks, no hope. I think the limitation with the Brunei chair, the lack of results, and then Cambodia's next, or pretty much the next 1 year, we should not be expecting a lot out of ASEAN. But what you said about the international intervention, the modality for the intervention, the modality, the channel, is something I think that deserves a wider hearing. You know, the UNSC, the UN Secretary General, but if this kind of intervention can be regionalized, I think Ambassador Kasit, you're talking about peacekeeping force that includes that features China and ASEAN members, and maybe those ASEAN members would be the more regime governments like Indonesia, Malaysia, but even Thailand also has a peacekeeping force, the UN peacekeeping operations. The big question, as you alluded, as you noticed for sure, is it's Russia, and I think that you know, even China might go along with this, but Russia could be the spoiler. But what you're saying is that to increase the costs for Russia's non-compliance or lack of cooperation, for Russia to feel that the cost would be very high. Is that the case? How do we deal with, you know, Russia in this mix? Is a new phenomenon in a way. I mean, it has a lot to gain, a little bit to lose, not much to lose really, and it has been providing support, selling weapons. It's got a seat at the table at a very low cost or no cost. So would Russia, what to do with Russia if it just vetoes this entire any kind of modality that could come up?
I think I can use the President Bush words, maybe, but in a positive sense, the coalition of the willing. So I'm looking from the ASEAN point of view towards all the dialogue partners. So in that sense, you know, it doesn't have to be the 10 ASEAN meeting the dialogue partners. I think there could be a continuation of the meeting in Jakarta on the 24th of April under I think the hosting of Indonesian president. He can call a second meeting in Jakarta, inviting the Chinese, the Americans, Australia, New Zealand, India, all the dialogue partners, including Russia, if they are willing to come. And the willing members of the ASEAN community, Malaysia, Singapore, the Philippines would definitely come. If Cambodia is reluctant, then you don't have to come. Vietnam, Laos, Vietnam might come. I think because Vietnam think more in a regional and international context. The Thai government, okay, they should come because there will be more pressures forthcoming on General Prayut. So in that sense, I would say sort of a loosely organized ASEAN plus meeting. It doesn't have to be the 10 ASEAN, but I think the few willing ASEAN, and I definitely under the leadership of Indonesia president, I think many other ASEAN, the rest of the ASEAN have to think twice whether they would come or not. And then at the same time, we can invite the SAC General Mong Eng Lai on one side, and then the representative of the combined democratic opposition forces to be led possibly by NUG. That would be to Jakarta for the second Jakarta meeting. So we can have the coalition of the willing in order to bring back democracy to Myanmar. I think that could be done. And then the whole thing could be announced or to be tabled for information at the UNSC meeting, which could be held anytime, and at the upcoming UNGA in September. I think that could be done. And at the same time, I think we have to call out also to the former prime ministers of the world that had formed the group called the Elders. And one of the key members, non-prime minister, is His Excellency Ban Ki-moon, the former UN Secretary General. They have been very active. So they could come in also in Jakarta. They could send one representative and so on to provide the weight and the credence to the whole thing that we are going to turn back authoritarian rule, military intervention in Myanmar to end it for good. And we have to stand with the youth, with the new generation of Myanmar and other democratic citizens of ASEAN as a whole. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. So coalition of willing, but maybe also among the like-minded countries. And I think this has potential, Ambassador Kasit, and we can explore some more later on. I think it will be somewhat complicated by the COVID emergencies and imperatives. But nevertheless, this is a time for some new thinking, new proposals worth exploring. I have some questions now from audiences, and the floor is now open. So please feel free to ask questions. And I'll just take the first one. I'll field the first one now about recognition. Wake, a Watkale, our audience member Watkale is saying that asking why the UK, United Kingdom, sending a new ambassador and accepting a new ambassador from Myanmar. What does this mean for the NUG government? Would Amin Tan, can I invite you to talk a little bit about recognition? Also, maybe Debbie, who to recognize from Myanmar. In UK's case, the new ambassador, but even beyond. Amin Tan, would I invite you to talk a little bit about NUG recognition? Should the NUG be the sole legitimate voice and representation of Myanmar?
Like I'll get in trouble answering that question. But I think when it comes to recognition of the NUG, they are the political body that has the most legitimate political mandate in Myanmar right now. I think the trick there is that the NUG is not entirely made up of who had won the 2020 election, and so it makes it a bit difficult for foreign governments to officially recognize them as the government of Myanmar. I definitely don't think they should be considered the only political voice of Myanmar, in that this is a body that was put together in a way, under very strenuous political and physically dangerous circumstances. So it's not like they could hold a new election, but it was not put together in a way that is necessarily democratic. And so I understand the difficulty of foreign governments in recognizing the NUG, but on the other hand, the SAC absolutely cannot be recognized as the government of Myanmar. And in the UK case, especially, where there was essentially a coup within the coup at the UK, the Myanmar embassy in the UK. The actions that the UK government took there in trying to stay neutral implicitly supported the SAC. And I think that is something that is very important to emphasize right now with foreign government. Yes, there is very little leverage that especially Western democracies have over the Tatmadaw, but in trying to maintain the stance of neutrality, whether that is through delivery of humanitarian aid or these sort of like political maneuverings, it is much more likely that they are to end up tacitly implying that the SAC is the government rather than truly staying politically neutral.
Yeah, thank you. So
I just wanted to weigh in.
I'll come to you. And also, I'll come to you in just 1 second. Debbie and Ambassador Kasit, I know you have very helpful inputs, but it's less straightforward than we might think. I mean, the NUG, SAC, of course, very unpopular, but NUG also, as Amin Tan has brought up, is very diverse. It's got different groups, different columns, and also, there's an issue. I think some countries have reservations on NUG because of the previous Rohingya crisis and issue. Okay, Debbie.
I think Ajahn Kassit was also discussing this yesterday, that it's not a new Myanmar ambassador to the UK. It's actually a charge d'affaires. And the reason that was done is that the charge, if Myanmar were to present, if the junta was going to present officially an ambassador, the UK has the discretion of refusing to receive their credentials. So the charge is an interim measure. I think that's the issue. So the UK has actually officially not recognized this charge. But with all fairness, the NUG government, which was formed by the CRPH, represents 76% of the MPs elect. And if you look at how the NUG has been doing its comms, it's actually been more effective and more comprehensive in the way it's been communicating and its responsiveness to domestic popular opinion. So we at the moment have the most inclusive and diverse cabinet in the history of Myanmar, where more than half of them are from non-Burman ethnic nationalities, and we also have the first openly gay man on the cabinet. So I think if we were to judge what the SAC has done in the past 6 months with what the NUG has done since its formation in April, we can already see very well that the NUG has been able to overcome some very significant security and logistical operational barriers to start getting the work done. And this is something which is quite important. Of course, there are going to be some legacy issues, but though we need to support the progressive voices in the NUG to ensure that the inclusion of the Rohingya, and even an apology to the Rohingya, which was done by the Minister for Women and Children's Affairs and the Minister for Human Rights, is actually part of the overall NUG approach and policy. So I think, one of the great things about, if people say, what are you optimistic about? What I'm optimistic about is that there has been a transformation of the politics. This is no longer an anti-coup movement. This is a movement to actually fix the problems of the past and move Myanmar into a more inclusive, a more diverse, and a more modern state.
Okay, Ambassador Kassit, you have a lot of experience with the international diplomacy and the UN, please.
Two sentences. One is that is the question of recognizing democratic forces, okay, in the name of NUG for all its incompleteness and so on, and a denial of non-democratic forces at the UN, namely the SAC or the military junta. So it's all for the democracies around the world to give recognition to a democratic entity of Myanmar. That's the first point. Second, whether they control the territory or not, I just would like to go back a bit to the immediate history, that we did recognize the CGDK, the tripartite alliance of the Cambodians under King Norodom Sihanouk against the Khmer Rouge and the Vietnamese forces and so on. They did not control any territory, but the credentials of CGDK were being recognized annually at the UN General Assembly session throughout that period of getting the Vietnamese out of Cambodia. So there have been many precedents in the past, So it's the question of, I think, pushing back authoritarian and rebuilding democracy. I think that should be the the overall umbrella, and then the rest of things you could follow. And that's for democracy around the world to think deeply rather than just to be so legalistic and interpretation of international rules and law and so on. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Ambassador Kisiti. Using the democratic credentials as a benchmark, I think might be problematic with the international community, with the different regimes across the world and so on. But the CGDK, that's a very good precedent. This is the coalition government of democratic Cambodia back in the 80s. And this was a government, a shadow government that actually had international recognition. So there's some example of shadow governments being recognized by the international community. I have a question here from an audience member about the EAOs and the PDFs. The People's Defense Forces, they are out there, they are everywhere, but they are also fragmented. And the ethnic armed organizations, EAOs, they're more recognizable, but overall the armed columns of opposition, they seem fragmented. So the question here is about this fragmentation. It goes against them. Does it go against them? And then I'll just ask this to Dr. Matt Arnold about the EAOs and PDFs, the dynamics. Can they come together? Can they join forces? To what extent can they do it? I also would just pose this to Aung Zaw. It's like Thailand, like many countries, when you have opposition groups, one thing they have in common is they want to kick out, they want to uproot the incumbent regime, the regime in power. So in this case, the SSC, the Tatmadaw. But the opposition groups, they're so diverse. And then, the next step is, what do they want to have as a future? What could be the future contours of a kind of a replacement regime, if not the Tatmadaw SAC? Dr. Matt Arnold, first, maybe you on the EAOs, PDFs, and any chance of joining forces and galvanizing and coordinating, with a more centralized chain of command?
Thank you. I think for me, one of the most important things that we see happening right now is that the scale and intensity of the conflict across the regions is significant, and I think unique historically. I give the example of South and Central Sagaing or Northern Magway, but also down across Bago into Irrawaddy. And at the end of the day, in American English, we say skin in the game. I think for a lot of the EAOs, they've rightly been hesitant to engage too much against the SAC unless they believe that the majority part of the population is also going to join the fight. Because there's no desire to do all the fighting and attract SAC to their areas alone. And so, I mean, in a nutshell, that's kind of the crux of the matter. And so I think to some extent we cross that, where we do see significant amounts of conflict and resistance against the SAC across the Bamar majority regions. And I think personally, this is probably the biggest threat to the SAC, because in no way are they structured to deal with that. For 70 years, their entire force structure has been premised on fighting ethnic minority insurgencies in places like Kachin and Shan. There was some Communist Party action back in the early 60s in Irrawaddy and Bago, but fundamentally, the Tatmadaw is not structured to crush a rebellion, especially if it's very intense across those Bamar heartland areas. And I think that the reality with a lot of this stuff, I mean, when you look at war, what you need to look at is who has the momentum and what is the trajectory. And the simple truth is that outcomes on the battlefield do more to shape the politics than anything else. And if you start seeing significant successes against the SAC, and we've already seen quite a few, you start to see those aggregations and those realignments of forces happen. And personally, I would expect that would quicken. I mean, I would give the example where we've seen the KIA have some very successful attacks in the last couple of weeks with PDFs in northern Sagaing. We've also seen that with some of the Karenni EAOs and the Karenni PDFs. So I think to the question, can they work together? The answer is yes. Firstly, because they all hate the same group, the Tatmadaw and the senior generals who couldn't play a game where they had designed the actual rules. So nobody trusts the one institution for anything. Two, what we can also see is, can they work together? Yes, because it's effective. And so when you start to see groups working together, they'll be more effective. So I think a lot of people go on and on about how fragmented and scattered Myanmar is, and there's some truth to that. We also talk about how the Tatmadaw always does this divide and rule strategy. There's some truth to that too. But I really feel that the February 1 coup and the barbaric, utterly disgraceful violence by the military has so galvanized the entire population against it that we need to think about things with a new lens. I think the other reality in all of this is, can they work together? We need to accept one simple truth, which is, when a country is going through such a massive shift, we don't know all the pieces on the chessboard yet. Some of these groups that are now quite significant, like say the CDF in Chin, or some of the PDFs in the Karenni state, they didn't exist 5-6 weeks ago, but now they're significant actors. So all of this is in a massive state of flux, and the chessboard is still being set. So I think, and I think the trajectory of that is towards more coordination, more aggregation, especially, I mean, the senior general, I mean, these guys are so tone deaf. I mean, to think that he can say he's now prime minister and he's extending it for another 2 years, it's just going to encourage more resistance. The other thing is, these massacres that they keep doing in places like Kani are also going to keep galvanizing resistance. So I mean, from a if you strip it even of morality and ethics, the tactics and the strategy of the SAC is just utterly moronic. So I'll leave it at that.
Okay, thank you very much. Aung Zaw, I mean, lots of opposition groups and the lack of coordination, not just among PDFs and EAOs and so on, but moving forward to the civilian side as well. And you see this, this is in Thailand too. There's a lot of opposition groups. They know what they don't want. They know what they don't like. But how do they come together for a common future? You've been in opposition for a long time. You've had good perspective. What do you think? What would be your advice, recommendation for? It is early days for the opposition groups to think about common future, but never too early. Aung Zaw.
Right. Well, Titinan, I think I saw Imitan was raising her hand. I think she has something to say. Anyway, I just want to, look at the in 1988, we have seen that NDF, National Democratic Forces, and all the ethnic groups who haven't signed a ceasefire with the regime. At that time, they have total forces of 35,000. Except the Communist Party of Burma that disgruntled and faced a mutiny in 1989, which is about 15,000. Today, if you look at the EAO and all the signed and unsigned ceasefire groups, we have about 90,000 EAO active members. I think we have to have a much more, I think, clear understanding and of nuances of the coordination among the EAO and non-EAO members, because they are the forces. They are important. They oppose the military coup. I think the international community, we talk about ASEANs, including China, which has a stake over some of the EAO around the border areas. I think there hasn't been clear policy how we should have a treatment and a policy, a proper policy to deal with the EAO, because they're going to be very important game maker and in the immediate future. They already are in the playing field because of the PDF forces and a lot of resistant forces, those who oppose the regime, those barbarian regime. They all are in hope of looking at the EAO as the counter forces. So I think this is one thing important that we have to look at. And second is that in theory, we would like to see the military as a part of the solution, not part of the problem. But now SEC is part of the problem. So I think the second is the reform in the military. If you look at from that perspective, if you talk about the reform in the military, not just the military itself alone, we have to include the EAO and all these armed forces, a lot of armed actors and the stakeholders in ethnic regions. That's important because it's very much in the military. Look at the very Burmanized Burman control at the top level, and then the third is the opposition or NUG or other forces, how they treat this current state of dilemma that Myanmar has been facing. Because of, for the first time in the history for the last 20 to 30 years, we've seen that disgruntled, dissatisfied, unhappy military officers and the soldiers quietly or openly joining the CDM movement. What sort of attractive package do the opposition have to lure them or treat them, give them incentive, so that those soldiers and officers who wanted to be a good soldiers, who want to serve to protect the country, defend the country, be a professional soldier, I think they will start to decide which side they're going to take. And the SAC will start to think, their days are becoming a number. And then the fourth is, I think, the economic factor. I think very important. I think we often ignore, because it is not election fraud or corruption charges against Aung San Suu Kyi NLD. If you look at study the Myanmar military and the history of the last 30 years, they have drafted the 2008 constitution that give them 25%. It's ridiculous to see them sit them in the parliament, and also they have controlled the key cabinet position in the government. It was a sweet deal. Even the sweet deal, they couldn't satisfy because they take over. They want to take back the whole 100%. So I think the 2008 constitution, economic power, I think they're one of the key factors, the military wanting to or decided to take back the power. It's not election fraud, it's just a justification. So I think we have to look at all these and treat them carefully and to look at it, the package. How are we going to look at a new Burma, a new future in the country with the international actor looking at these, I think, dynamics. And also, I don't want to correct, I'm not in a position.
Okay, thank you. Thank you very much. I think when you say package, you mean being inclusive. This kind of, in many ways, the power sharing was inclusive, but it has now it doesn't work anymore. So we have to kind of reconstitute the power sharing with democratic aspirations being fulfilled. We're just coming around to time now. I want to go around for the last round. There's a question about whether we're repeating the past. I think we've addressed that. This is new, not like the past 60s or 80s. There's a question about also aid. Whether foreign aid has been directed to the right places in Myanmar over the last decade, and perhaps what should aid donors be looking at, where to target their resources moving forward. There's a question also about the ASEAN and NUG, whether ASEAN has been talking to NUG at all. I think very limited. overall now, as a last round, I'll just come to Debbie first, and then maybe anyone else, maybe Amin Tant, and then Dr. Matt Arnold, and then Aung Zaw, if you have anything else to say, and then Ambassador Kasit. Moving forward now, it's been 6 months. ASEAN, I think, has been almost a common conclusion that is going to be very limited in its role. International community, international intervention might be needed increasingly, but in the coming months, the role of the SAC Tatmadaw is weaker than many people might think. But in the coming months, if we can kind of look at the trends a little bit, what should we be anticipating and how to prepare for it in view of the COVID emergency and crisis? Debbie, you had a hand up. I'll come to you first.
Thank you. I just wanted to echo Amin Tan's concerns that the worst-case scenario is if ASEAN is unable to shift the situation, and the best way for ASEAN to do this is to actually get out of the way, to not block international pressure, and for individual ASEAN states to work with like-minded dialogue partners to recognize the NUG, to actually find a way to push the military to actually step out of the way. And I think it's actually not that hard, because the military is increasingly starting to understand that they have been hijacked by Min Aung Hlaing's personal ambition and his ego. And they need to work something out. And the NUG itself has already engaged in a security sector reform framework, and has reached out to the armed forces security sector to say, this is our plan for security sector reform, this is our code of conduct, you're welcome to join us. And that's quite powerful, given that it's actually defectors from the Tatmadaw and the police that have been training the PDF and local resistance forces to in terms of battlefield strategies, and in Calais, in Minjan, in all of these places. So I think we do need to understand that we are at a knife edge, and ASEAN can either go in default mode and just blindly defend the junta, or they can be a bit smarter and recognize that they have to act in their own regional interests, and it's not in their interest to allow this situation to continue.
Okay.
Sorry. Also, we have to recognize also that 400 civil society groups in the first month of the coup were able to secure a suspension of $11 billion worth of disbursements from international financial institutions to the regime. And so we have to understand that there is a strong economic pressure on the military, that if they continue down this road, they might not even be able to afford to pay Russia for the arms that they have purchased. So we do actually have to recognize that economics is a factor that they cannot run away from. Sorry.
Okay, thank you, Debbie. Dr. Matt Arnold, from your experience in the field in different countries and your current research, what's your sense of the direction ahead on the armed conflict, internal conflict?
Yeah, I mean, I don't want to belabor the point, but I'd just like to echo Debbie's point. I like this term pragmatism in terms of engagement, because from a purely pragmatic perspective, I can't see how in any way it's logical to engage so much with SAC and not talk to the NUG. When a country is near universally revolting against a junta, which ASEAN countries itself don't recognize as the legitimate government, that it just strikes me like the whole approach is so logically flawed. Anyway, that point's been made repeatedly. My takeaway for the coming future is this thing is just picking up. I mean, what I talked about was an escalating revolt. It's not like we're plateauing. This thing is escalating. And if SAC is pressed now, they're going to be even more pressed sooner than later. The COVID-19 situation is the wild card, and how it will have massive ramifications. But fundamentally, it's very difficult to see how SAC, the junta, they can call themselves whatever they want, but they're still just the same, how they regain the initiative to form a legitimate government that can control the country. So yeah, it's going to escalate, and the trajectory doesn't favor the junta. Over.
Okay, thank you very much, Dr. Matt Arnold. Amy Tant, would you be able to share any sense of the direction ahead? Briefly.
Yeah, I think what we're looking at is a long, protracted struggle, unless some very sort of wild, large things beyond the current COVID crisis happens that really changes the situation on the ground. And I think as the international community, what really needs to be mind forward is that this institution that has shown that it would rather rule over a country with a much smaller population if it means that they win. They're not interested in sort of being a government that functions in the best interests of their people, even if it or if that means sort of compromising what they see as the ultimate victory. And so, as we see this crisis develop and get worse, and sort of these news actors come in, I think it's really important for us to remember to center the people first. If that means direct payments, cash disbursements, being flexible, especially as international donors, about how we think about accountability and transparency with funding, and to really prioritize safety. Because this isn't anytime soon, and we need to really think about what will save the most lives without legitimizing this regime.
Okay, thank you very much. I think moving forward, a lot to focus on lives first. I think also the trend is of the escalation, and maybe the situation is likely to get worse before it can get any better. So that's something we have to be prepared for. Also, you already made a very important point about inclusiveness and then the package you're talking about for a common future. Would you have anything to add quickly?
Oh, not much. I think I really enjoyed this discussion, but I just want to say a bit word on the cross-border, because Debbie mentioned a very important word, which I also write it down. Yeah, the cross-border assistance is very important. I think Burma is going to be destabilized. It's going to have a major, huge impact, catastrophic, effect on the neighboring countries, including China and Thailand and Bangladesh and India. And that we all should be open-minded and prepared that we have a cross-border assistance and set up the COVID buffer-free zones in all these areas, given assistance. This is the first thing. Second is forget about ASEAN. I think it will be foolish to expect anything from ASEAN. So we have to look beyond ASEAN if we want to change the system and the changes inside the country. And also, I think the legitimacy, regime is really hungry for the legitimacy. That's why they established a caretaker government. So making sure that we don't provide any loan, any assistance, any sort of sense of legitimacy to the regime. And there are a lot of good, interesting, legitimate people with the mandated people working in NUG and other different kind of front, and they should be equally treated and given more prominence in the international forum and treat them with the legitimate leaders. And then third, I think lastly, it's important not to forget China, because China is very worried. China is keeping distance from this current regime, but we don't know how China is going to sway over the coming months. Because of Myanmar economy is very much dependent on our time with China. And if there is anything we're going to make international pressure, or international community is going to involve and dramatically involved in Myanmar to change the reform and to change SAC. I think the role of China shouldn't be discounted. I think China is very important. We have to put the China on board.
Thank you very much, Aung Zaw. Ambassador Kasit, ASEAN is under the gun here. I mean, this discussion has been laid down on ASEAN. Nevertheless, ASEAN is having some very significant, important meetings coming up around the ASEAN-centered summits with the US and ASEAN Summit, the EAS, the East Asia Summit in the second half of the year. Many would say that it's better to have ASEAN than not to have ASEAN for regional peace and stability. But on Myanmar, ASEAN has been very disappointing. You've raised some issues about what should be done moving forward. But as a last, would you have any last takeaway thought for us to consider? Please.
3 points. One, I would like to suggest that you, Dr. Thitinan, summarize the discussion today, and then you can write to Brunei Foreign Minister, and then CC everything to all the dialogue partners, including the UN Secretary General. I think the conclusion from our group. Second, I think we have to urge the international community to open up to NUG. And I think we can press not only China, but the second country that I would like to urge to press is Indonesia. Once Indonesia talk to NUG, I think the rest of ASEAN and so on would come around. And third is that we have to press the Thai government to open the border. Once the Thai government open the border, I think a lot of humanitarian concern will be, I think, what you call put in place and so on. So Thailand on the humanitarian and on the anti-COVID side is a very key country indeed. And I think we have to appeal to the Thai government, to the Thai parliament, to the Thailand's national human rights and so on. That it's about time now that Thailand fully opened the border for humanitarian assistance. Thank you.
Thank you very much. We've exceeded time, and I apologize for that. I think we've had a very fruitful, constructive discussions with some concrete proposals. I think moving forward, a lot of dynamics on the ground. Things are very anxious, and I think situation may actually get worse before it can improve. So on that note, we'll stay on top of what's happening in Myanmar from ISIS Thailand. I want to thank Dr. Matt Arnold, Amin Tan, Aung Zaw, Deputy Stothard, and Ambassador Kasit. Thank you very much, and thank you for joining us from audience members. Thank you.